Of all the abandoned places I visited over the years of running my channel, I can say without a moment's hesitation that Laughlandi was easily the worst. A lot of those places were creepy when you were there, but honestly, Laughlandi is the only one that still freaks me out when I think about it now, all these years later. Not just because of the place itself, but mostly because of the clown. For around 5 years in my early 20s, just after YouTube started to monetize their videos for creators, but before being an influencer as a career was a thing, I made a tidy amount of money by filming myself as I visited and investigated a huge number of abandoned and often supposedly haunted places. Nowadays, that doesn't sound like much, because every idiot with a mobile phone and too much time on their hands can make a TikTok of themselves breaking into a place whilst their friend in the next room screams to make something they hope will go viral. Back then though, it was an original concept. Apart from one other guy in the US and a couple in Russia, I can honestly say that me and a guy named Ricky were amongst the first people to do that kind of stuff. If you go way back on YouTube and look up some of the first videos to do that sort of deal, you will find me eventually. We were amongst the first. Over the years, we broke into everywhere, ignoring the stay out danger signs and avoiding the security guards. We snuck into everything from abandoned hospitals to old churches, abandoned railway stations, and supermarkets. We even broke into an old mannequin factory once, but that's a story for another time. I'm not ashamed to say that a lot of these places, in the middle of the night and in their super rundown condition, were creepy as hell. But Laughlandi was something else. Though it advertised itself as a theme park, Laughlandi was actually more of an overgrown fun fair spread out a little bit more than it should have been. The park itself operated for around 2 decades, up in the north of England. I've changed its name, obviously, because I don't fancy being sued right now, but if you look up abandoned theme parks in northern England on Google, you'll find it soon enough. The park was your typical fairground, with mostly quite dated rides and a few more modern roller coasters that were repainted and renamed every few years to try to get the crowds back in. Exactly the same ride, just a new name. Soon enough, people caught on. Unfortunately, the park just didn't have the investment to keep up with the bigger names and more exciting rides of the huge theme parks. And after a while, the lack of money being pumped back into the place started to show. By the time I visited the park as a kid, a few years before it closed, the rot had already set in. The paint on the booths and sideshows where you could buy candy floss or try to win prizes by throwing beanbags at coconuts was already peeling. Even the newer rides looked worn and weathered, whilst the older rides were decades out of date. In fact, some, like the teacups and the caterpillar ride that had been purchased from other fairgrounds in Europe, were literally Victorian, being mostly constructed of wood and plasterboard. By the early 90s, the park was already in financial difficulties, but it was the news stories about a guy called Judd Baker that really sent them under. Baker, it seems, used to work on Laughland's creepy old ghost train, which, though it too was dated and cheesy as hell, did succeed in putting the frights up people by having a live-action actor toward the end of each ride. This actor, if you can call jumping out on people to scare them acting, would first stand amongst the wax figures of zombies and vampires, pretending to be one of them. Then, when the carriage got close, he would reach out to touch the passengers riding in the cars to give them a fright. The unsuspecting customers, having laughed at the hokey figurines up to that point, still jumped out of their skin when one of them actually moved toward them. It was a clever twist. Nowadays, this is a technique done all over the world, and it's a bit old hat, but back in the day, just like my short films of abandoned places, it was original and still a surprise to people. Where the problem started for Laughlandi was when Judd was arrested and charged with crimes that meant he should not have been permitted to touch anyone alone in the dark, let alone kids. Whilst the park shouldn't have been blamed for Judd's crimes, they were to blame for not running proper criminal records checks on their staff. It turned out Judd had been in prison before for similar crimes, and the employers should have known that. Once that got into the papers, the park was finished. Suddenly, parents didn't want their kids being hugged by the guy in the cuddly bear suit for fear of who might be under it, and they certainly didn't want their kids going around on a ghost train that had real horrors waiting for them in the dark. So, in the late 90s, the place closed, shuttered up its rides, boarded up its stands, and erected fences all around. What was cool for us as investigators, however, was that the owners never went in and actually ripped this stuff down. They always thought they'd be able to sell the stuff on, and eventually, when that didn't happen, disposing of the stuff became more expensive than just leaving it to rot, so the place still stands. Seriously, you can still see drone footage of the place on YouTube now. All the rides are still there, the figurines gone all mouldy, but still there with their fixed, creepy smiles. The rides and booths are covered in graffiti from folks who managed to break in, and many are almost completely overgrown with weeds, moss and ivy. A lot of the structures have literally fallen apart, so that, for example, the roller coaster now looks like the rusted skeleton of some huge metallic dinosaur, but it is still there. It was a perfect setting for us to explore. So, as part of a Halloween special, me and Ricky took out trusty wire cutters and flashlights and broke in through an entrance around the back of the park. As soon as we got inside, we knew we'd hit gold. The whole place looked spooky as hell. Within seconds of getting inside, we passed the old teacup ride that had a tree growing through the middle of it, the roots spilling over the seats where punters had once giggled with joy. On the remains of every ride, the fiberglass figures with their weird, distorted smiles grinned down at us. In short, the place was unnerving long before we got to our chosen target, the ghost train. When we actually reached the ride, we were thrilled to see that what was already a frightening-looking old attraction had been made much worse by the fact that the old timber roof had fallen in. Being the so-called adventurers that were, however, we decided that this wasn't going to stop us, and that with a few quick snaps from the crowbar, we broke inside to take a look around. Walking slowly along the rusted tracks of what used to be Laughlin's old ghost train was an eerie feeling. There was, it seemed, almost a fog, a strange, rotten atmosphere, as if the place were festering away on top of a pile of traumas and bad memories. It's hard to explain, but creeping quietly through the narrow corridors of black-painted walls, all adorned with rubber bats and fake-looking spiderwebs, I suddenly felt an overwhelming urge to turn back and get out. As I mentioned, by this point I had visited a whole host of other abandoned places. I was not the kind of person who spooked easily, but by the time we turned the corner and saw a line of wax figures, badly painted monsters hanging out of coffins and spring-loaded mannequins in cheap rubber masks, I'd decided that I'd seen enough. Turning back toward the camera, I made some excuse about hearing a security guard somewhere behind me and rushed quickly toward the doors that marked the end of the ride, only to suddenly stop dead. Not 3 meters in front of where Ricky and I had scrambled to was one of the carriages that would have taken people around on the ghost train, still stuck to the tracks exactly where the owners would have left it all those years earlier. Problem was, this car wasn't empty. Sitting with his back to us on the left-hand side of the carriage, staring directly forward, was a man, dressed so it seemed at first glance, as a clown. Though I could only see the back of the head, the neck and shoulders, I could see that the figure was wearing a huge orange wig of tight, curly hair and a jumpsuit of shimmering silver and purples with a ring, like the petals of a flower around his neck as a collar. Bringing my torch to rest on the back of his head, I assumed and hoped that perhaps this was another of the mannequins, a wax model of a fiberglass figurine that had been placed in the seat as a joke by Staff Joke before they left, or by vandals in the years between. But the space between the orange hair and the soldiers told me otherwise. That, I knew, was skin, pale and rubbery, but skin nonetheless. I called out to the figure, now convinced that it was someone who had also broken in, or perhaps a vagrant who had come here long ago and set up home in the ruins of the ride. Why he would be dressed as a clown I did not know. Slowly, as if deliberately taking his time about the motion, the figure turned and showed a face. Its face. Whether he was actually smiling, or simply wore the smile of a clown, I am unsure. What I can say is that the face was fully painted with makeup. The white grease paint face, the red button nose and huge too-wide smile, framed in the color of blood. He stared for a moment, then pointed to the seat next to him as the ride seemed to creak back into life and the car jolted forward. Ricky and I ran, not just because we were scared of ghosts, but because anyone committed enough to sit alone in a ghost rain at midnight totally dressed as a clown was probably not of sound mind. It was not until we reached home that we began to dissect what we had just seen and tried in vain to make some sense of it. Perhaps, Ricky suggested, it was someone who used to work there, or someone who liked the ride, but had gone a little mad in their old age and liked to go back to visit. Perhaps, I thought, perhaps. Back when this happened, the internet was still slow, and the information on it was not as all-encompassing as it is today. Either that, or I just didn't know how to research as well as I do now. Either way, it was not until years later that I looked into the history of the ghost train and found what I thought was a link. The explanation did not ease my mind. The articles I found explained how the disgraced worker Judd Baker used to work the ghost train dressed from head to toe as a clown. Despite having been told by management several times that a clown was not a suitable character for the ghost train, the outfit did seem to frighten people, and there are tons of comments on Reddit and other forums remembering that ride that specifically mentioned the creepy old clown. Telling Ricky about this, he suggested that perhaps Baker was affected by his time in jail and returned to the last place he remembered when they let him out. Maybe he was mentally ill, Ricky suggested. Stranger things have happened. It was an interesting theory. Certainly when I looked at the photo included with the story, I could see a clear match. To this day, I would swear on anything you asked me to that the photograph and the man I saw dressed as a clown in the ghost train were the same person. The person I saw, without a shadow of a doubt, was Judd Baker, and one glance at the footage we shot would confirm that. though of course that's impossible. Judd Baker died in prison 4 years before we broke into Laughland. In keeping with the wishes expressed in his will, he was buried in full makeup, wearing an orange wig and silver and purple jumpsuit. He was buried dressed as a clown. Due to the nature of his crimes, where exactly he was buried was kept a secret by his family. I will never know for sure where they put him, but I think I could hazard a guess.